What's up, Toro students? I'm Mr. Martinez,
Mr. Santiago here.
and this is History Talks. If you don't remember, History Talks is our lecture lessons in our world history class that we package into a nice video created for you to simply listen, learn, and take some small notes on the side as you learn some of the lessons that we have packaged in here. Not only are you going to be following through with the video, but of course there'll be small pauses in the video where you're going to have a moment to give some answers to some things you recently learned in a check for understanding thing. But if you can see right here, today's topic is an interesting one. It is the rise of totalitarianism. That's a big word, totalitarianism. As you know, in our classes, we've been focusing hard on what that word means and the characteristics of it and the leaders that come from it. That's going to be our focus today in our class. As you guys can see, far as our standards go, we're going to analyze the rise, aggression, and the human cost of totalitarian regimes, both fascist and communist. We'll be looking at a few countries in particular, some of our candidates that are from Germany, Italy, and a new country called the Soviet Union. That's going to be our focus within our standards. Before we do get started though, I think it's important for us to have a quick recap, just remembering all the lessons we've been taking in, both from Russian Revolution and World War I, if you remember that lesson. If you remember in World War I, we talked about the causes of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But those problems didn't just stay with World War I, they continued to be a problem later, which becomes into World War II. In the 1940s to the mid-1940s. Now, on top of World War I, we talked about the alliances that were created within those two teams, but we talked more importantly about who were the losers during World War I, which led to the Treaty of Versailles. This Treaty of Versailles, we mentioned, was a big deal for the losers, which ended up being Germany, as they had to lose a lot of different things. Not only tons of money, but of course some land, what was left of their colonies, and now had new rules on them like limiting their military, how many weapons they have, and just their military capabilities as a country. Like I said, money was one of the bills, and it was a lot of it, $33 billion, which is a lot. That would lead Germany into a recession and a Great Depression of their own. But they're not the only ones that we talked about that were struggling. Russia was another one, and they were struggling even earlier. They had to call it quits in the middle of World War I as they were having a revolution and civil war with a new leader, Lenin, and his leadership team being the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, and now his new country called the Soviet Union with his full control. Those were the things that we just learned in our class a few weeks ago. And all of that's going to be important going into our next lesson. So, who are our candidates? Who are these people that we're going to be mentioning? Well, before we learn about them, we want to keep this central question in mind. How does the drive for power reignite global conflict? Keep that question in mind as we learn about some of these candidates in class, as we see how they all had very similar characteristics and all had very interesting rises in their country. But don't forget what that word totalitarianism is. Mr. Santiago, remind us, what is totalitarianism?
It is a concept, a form of government or political system that prohibits opposition parties. It restricts individual opposition to the state and its claims and exercises an extremely high degree of control over public and private life. There's an emphasis there. prohibits opposition parties. So anyone who's against your way of thinking, watch out. Restricts individual opposition to the state. So if you're one of those individuals who are like, I don't like what's going on here, but you're in this form of government, be careful. You better not talk. And exercise highly extreme control over public and private life. Remember, anything that you do or say is being monitored. So you have to be careful. This form of government is extreme, and you'll learn why in just a little bit.
That's right. And we have kind of mentioned some of the characteristic aspects of it. You guys remember last time in class, we talked about the 8 common characteristics from indoctrination, propaganda, censorship, charisma, terror, and all these other ones. All of these are all a part of the recipe of totalitarianism. Now, we're going to actually put faces to actual people who represent this concept in this time of history. As you guys can see, this is all a huge direction in human history that we're noticing that leads to this big rise. Not only just in one place, but it starts to spread in a lot. But in Europe, you start to see the biggest spike and the biggest characters that put a big impact on the next chapter of world history. So what are those names? What are those faces? Mr. Santiago, introduce our candidates here for totalitarianism.
So the man to the left, we have Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union, USSR, 1941 to 1953, and arguably the most famous, Adolf Hitler from Germany, 1933 to 1945. And then we have Benito Mussolini from Italy, 1943 to 1945.
Very nice. Something I think is fascinating about these 3 individuals is right before each of these 3 gentlemen get into politics and start to take over in their country, they were all just very average people during World War I. Matter of fact, all 3 were just average private soldiers in the trenches in World War I, and eventually after reached up the ladder for power. But they were just average Joes. Let's learn about each of these characters and how they did succeed in taking these countries to the point where they get absolute control over them. Our first one is Joseph Stalin. Remember, he is now the new leader of a new country called the Soviet Union, which was once called Russia. Now, if you remember from your Russian Revolution class, you remember that we talked about another gentleman who first started this revolution called Lenin. When Lenin dies, Stalin comes to power. He was an associate of Lenin, who then takes up the ranks of the Communist Party. Russia becomes that USSR nation, the new one, after the Civil War, that people were fighting over the terrible conditions they faced over numerous years in their Russian history. Now, when Joseph Stalin does become leader, he has to rebuild a country. He has to reimagine a country, how it looks, how it works, and how it operates, especially under this new idea of communism. Now, let's talk a little bit about that communism idea and Stalin and how he implements it in Russia. Now, the first thing that you see that the Soviet Union does when it becomes a country is it instantly wants to control the economy. Economies is talking about money, if you remember. Economies run very differently in different countries, but this country wants to do it differently. Instead of letting it be a part of the free market where people can handle it on their own with less rules, Stalin wants the government to own the entire economy. Every business, every aspect of it, every employee works for the government now, not for individual companies or individual people. And it's this idea that if it's all well planned together, it will work a lot better than leaving it to individuals. So he creates this 5-year plan, this idea of trying to fix the country under this new communist rule. Unfortunately, there's a lot of issues with it, with workers being forced to high quotas. There was some aspects of how industry improved with the rapid pressure that Stalin put on his people, But overall, there was a lack of resources, and a lot of people suffered trying to keep up with the new expectations of their new ruler. Not only did he change the whole economy, but he even changed how agriculture works and how farmers operate. Essentially taking all land from all citizens, the government not only owns homes, but they own agriculture. So farmers had to get used to the idea of something called agriculture collectivism or collectives, which is this idea that all the crops you make, you have to give to the government. And the government will decide how much they'll pay you for all the crops you make, as the government is your only customer you get to have. So it's this weird system that has a lot of issues with a lot of farmers. It leads to a lot of new social issues with food shortages that the Soviets are going to have to face.
So a checkpoint here. What changes did Stalin make and what were their outcomes? So again, what changes did Stalin make and what were their outcomes? Think about that.
Good job. Yeah, well done. If you put the answer that Stalin took over the economy and agriculture and tried to reinvent the economy under government control. This did lead to some bad outcomes, as you guys saw, with food shortages and also some new expectations that will be penalizing people who don't follow them. All right. Talking about penalizing, so that was a good method of Stalin's when he decided to run this country of his. He used terror as a weapon a lot. Matter of fact, Stalin committed several crimes against humanities, as many of these totalitarians normally do. And they're especially against his own people. Not against foreigners, but he attacks his own people. There's many things besides just the violation of individual rights, but Stalin was really good about trying to eliminate anybody who criticizes him. He had a secret police and spies monitor the entire neighborhood, turn neighbors against neighbors who were all trying to play a test of who was more loyal. And if someone suspected of someone not being loyal enough, the secret police would show up and that person would instantly be sent to a prison or a gulag, as the Russians call it. Tons of prisons were filled with Russians for people who were suspected of not being loyal or who were not satisfied with the government.
Mr. Martinez, is it true that during this terror, people were erased or deleted by Stalin?
That is very true. Matter of fact, Stalin was very much a very petty person when he gets in arguments. Not only would he erase people from existence, not only from Earth, but their whole history, their name, their impact on Earth. Matter of fact, he even had friends like a gentleman named Trotsky, who was close to Stalin, but when Stalin thought he was betraying him and had him exterminated, he had his own government go through every picture he took with Trotsky and erase him out of it, the first kind of like photoshopping. So he would literally erase people from history if he thought they weren't loyal to him. Not only his friends, but even, of course, the citizens, which you see with the next aspect, which was the Great Purge. The Great Purge is when essentially Stalin really had a systematic system created to identify people in basic society who weren't loyal to him and have them be eliminated. There was a big purge of this, and millions of Soviets faced hardship through Stalin.
All right, so we have a quick checkpoint here, guys. How did Stalin begin to terrorize his own people? And why did he begin to do this? So again, how did he begin to terrorize his own people? And why did he begin to do this?
Good job. Thank you for responding to that. And yes, Stalin started doing this, terrorizing his people as a loyalty check to see if they were following the new Soviet agenda. And if they weren't, they were to be punished for not following the country's new direction. Now, like we talk about, totalitarianism is not just about being a ruler and having political power. They want power over everything with its citizens' lives. Stalin began to use propaganda, just like many of these gentlemen do, to create a personality he wanted from his people. Not only to boost their morale and faith within communism, but to also boost their faith within Stalin and his push to find that perfect communism dream that they were all aiming for. Something else interesting about Stalin and his control throughout society, communists actually waged a war on religion. Stalin actually, matter of fact, began that targeting as he thought that religious people were following the hierarchies of the old order. And he thought that they must be as close to Soviet as possible, which is to only be loyal to the country and not to a god or a religion, thinking that there was lies being within all of religion. This was his idea and pushed for all citizens to be atheists. No one was allowed to have any religion, which was a big deal because the Russians did have their own religion called Russian Orthodox that was allowed to exist in a very small scale, but even their own religion was suppressed. Not only foreign religion like Christianity, Hinduism, Muslim, and others.
All right, guys, we got another checkpoint here. So, why does Stalin believe religious groups are a threat to communism?
Well done, that's right. Religious order was considered a competition to his new Soviet order, and he believed that to be a true Soviet, to be committed to this, you were to not to be committed to any other aspects, especially things that he thought were lies. Other aspects within the Soviet society that we can recognize is the whole class warfare aspect, which is the big idea with communism. It's called class conscientious, which is the idea that you're able to be aware of the rich, poor, and middle class. And the idea of communism was to eliminate it. Now, with communism, there was an aspect of some benefits that came with it. If to eliminate all classes and allowing everything to be available, education was now available to all classes, especially with medical care, daycare, public recreation, and also housing for all of the Soviets. This was considered a big win for women in this time of history, as there was still a lot of pushes for equality and equal rights in most of Western society at this time.
All right, guys. So, how was communism beneficial for women? We just talked about that right now. How was communism beneficial for women?
Well done. Good job. Yep. We talked about a little bit of the women's history aspect of it and how in this time of history there was more equal rights being pushed as class warfare was being pushed on Soviet society. Now, we got our next candidate, our next conversation, which is Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Mr. Sanjay, would you like to introduce this next gentleman to us?
Adolf Hitler. So, at the outbreak of World War One, he was actually uh, in the war, World War One, and after though, he creates a political party. But why? Why did he create his own political party after World War One? Why would he do that? So back to what Mr. Martinez said at the beginning, the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had to pay $33 billion towards the cost of World War One. So with this, at this point, I'm going to toss the mic over to Mr. Martinez, but I want you guys to remember that because there's a reason why people are going to follow him. And I want
That's
you guys
okay.
to think about the Treaty of Versailles.
The Treaty of Versailles is deeply connected to Hitler. There is a giant bridge of connection between the two because people who are in distress or economic turmoil, people who are going through a lot of stuff, are more vulnerable and more willing to hear and listen to people and ideas that they normally wouldn't listen to. And that's what the case of Adolf Hitler was. He creates a party, and it was in the name of arguing against the Treaty of Versailles. He and these angry Germans were upset about the Treaty of Versailles being put all the blame on Germany. And he believed that was not fair for the Germans. He thought that was not true to history, as it wasn't the Germans who first caused the war to happen. But he also thought it wasn't right for Germany to lose. He thought Germans were going to win. So he was absolutely outraged by the Treaty of Versailles, which was their surrender. But it wasn't just that he was upset about. He wanted to gain a new country. He wanted to gain a new Germany in his way of seeing it. So this new political party, which was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, tried numerous times to try to acquire power in Germany. First, they had a coup and it failed. Matter of fact, Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. He gets out of prison. He's elected chancellor of the country that he was imprisoned by when he runs for an election. And over time, this new party he created, that's now called the Nazi Party, starts to gain popularity with him rising through the political ranks. Eventually, when his political party starts to become more of a threat, other parties start to oppose him, but he starts to oppress them with both violence and political force, suppressing his enemies, people who thought differently from him, giving his power and his party even more strength. It wasn't until the death of the president at that time, Hindenburg, who then released Hitler into finally the ultimate position, which was now going to be called the Führer. He removed the president aspect and gave him officially this new ranking of both vice president and president at the same time, essentially. And with that power, creates this new country called Nazi Germany. Not only does he create this infamous society, but he's also really, of course, known for instigating and starting World War II. Now, like I mentioned, Hitler used a lot of violence, both political and both physical force. There's two things we like to highlight with some of his infamous moments when he rose to power during that timeline. One is the Reichstag fire, which was essentially a fire that happened within the Capitol building of Germany. Blaming the communists, Hitler essentially was able to get new access to the government under this new emergency law put through, which allowed him to imprison communists and anyone he deemed an enemy at that time. Later on, as those opposing political parties try to push Hitler out, he does his last effort to eliminate his enemies through a really infamous night called the Night of Long Knives in 1934, where essentially Hitler commands his secret police to go into the middle of the night and assassinate 400 different political members that were against him, essentially eliminating his political party, eliminating them not only from office, but from existence. That put a huge amount of fear in Germany and made people believe that Hitler perhaps was onto something, that he was making the right move, as he was promising them that these were the enemies, that they were communists and against Germany.
Quick checkpoint, guys. How did Hitler gain absolute control of Germany?
Good job. Yep, there were multiple different ways how Hitler did it. But if you mention the Reichstag fire or the Night of Long Knives, that political and even physical force he committed with his party, that is the correct answer for how he got that control of Germany. Once he got control, there was a lot of changes he made for Germany. Remember, totalitarianism is not about just taking the political realm, you're taking the whole world, even your world, the personal and societal realms too. So he had complete control over the men, women, newspaper, radio, art, books, music, universities, schools, police, army, the courts, and religion. He had every aspect of Germany officially under his control. And through numerous propaganda that we've seen from all these candidates, but from especially Hitler, he starts to convince his people of a new idea of what society should look like. If you look right here in our next little paragraph, you see that we mention one of the main ideas that he pushes towards his Germans, which is this idea of racial superiority, which was the idea that the Germans were the master race or superior compared to any race. He became obsessed with this idea of racial purity and this idea of the master Aryan race, which Aryan was the idea of the German race being and looking like a blonde hair, blue eye, German specific nationality. Now, not the whole world looks like that. And in many countries with immigration and such, you would notice that not all of Germany would probably look like that. So what happens to people who don't have the look that Hitler is looking for his new country? Well, non-Aryan people would face tons of discrimination and violence, especially when it comes to the Jewish people, as they were considered inferior and undesirable. This creates what is called anti-Semitism. That's the wording for that hate of the Jewish people. A big thing that is pushed during Germany, as Hitler with his propaganda convinced his German people that the Jewish people were to be blamed for all of World War I and for all the misfortune of Germany, as it was their fault for what was happening to their country after World War I. He would convince people to hate these group of people so much that he would convince them that their elimination should be the solution, which comes with, of course, the concentration camps that were designed for the elimination of the Jewish race.
For those of you who are thinking, but that's wrong. But remember, if you were to be in opposition of that, in that form of government, you're going against Hitler. So even though we're like, this is wrong, you cannot be in opposition. So that's why, if you're thinking, how come no one rose up? Because what happens if you rise up, Mr. Martinez?
You would be locked up in the same camp with the people that would be locked up for being considered undesirable. And it wouldn't even be because you're going against Hitler, but he and his propaganda machine were so good and effective that essentially all of society at this aspect was super convinced by what Hitler was saying, as it wasn't just Hitler saying it, but it was your own school saying the same things about Jewish people, pushing stereotype and hate in there. The universities, music, books, art, radio, the newspaper, it was everywhere that was saying the things that Hitler wanted people to think. So you can imagine how difficult it was for someone who was a German person who knew this was wrong, but as you can see in this image, there are so many people who think it's right. So it's like going against the whole country, even knowing that it's wrong.
All right, a quick checkpoint. What arguments did Hitler use to gain approval from German citizens? Again, what arguments did Hitler use to gain approval from German citizens?
Good job. Thank you so much for responding to those. Let's keep that momentum as we keep learning about our people. With our last candidate now, our last one, Benito Mussolini of Italy. Now, Benito Mussolini is another totalitarian from Europe. Now, Benito Mussolini is one that's not as known, as he has a little bit of a different story for him. But his beginning is similar to both Hitler and Stalin. If you look at here in his timeline, after being kicked out of the Italian Socialist Party, Mussolini also joined World War I. He was injured and wounded, and of course, after serving his time within World War I, he decided to step out and had a new idea of what Italy should be. And especially when he thinks about the history of Italy. He remembers when it was to be like the Roman Empire back in like ancient history. And what Mussolini wants is to make Italy a big empire again. As the Roman Empire used to own the whole world, Mussolini wants to bring it back for Italy in this new time. So with his new party that he's created called the National Fascist Party, he's going to try to make Italy be this new vision of Rome, of the Roman Empire. So he has his movement, he marches into Rome, and he overthrows the last monarch of Italy. Once he has the country, he establishes his new fascist government where he slowly starts changing the laws, giving himself more power. And by 1927, he essentially has amounted all the power to himself, where not only is he as powerful as a king, but now he has given himself totalitarian reign over his country. Now, in the World War II story, you're going to see Mussolini and Hitler get along really well, and they're going to even join each other in World War II. But there's a sad story with how he ends. As you can see right here, Mussolini is overthrown by his own Italian people as they became upset with his direction and his and how he wanted to go into World War II and didn't like the results of it. And his own people actually have him dethroned and executed. But he had a lot of things done in his time of reign. As you guys can see right here, with Mussolini and his fascist party, after World War I, Benito Mussolini gained a lot of popularity with a lot of Italians who were also like him, with not being satisfied with how the Italian government was going and wanted that new fascist party. His political party also had like a secret police and also used a lot of violence as well. These ones were called the Black Shirts, who were the ones who committed these violent acts on suppressing any political party that was opposing them. Not only using terror and intimidation, but murder itself to try to get people in line for those who didn't follow Mussolini.
All right, a quick checkpoint. How did Mussolini and the Black Shirts rise to power? Again, how did Mussolini and the Black Shirts rise to power?
Good job. That's right. That recipe of terror, intimidation, and even violence to murder is how, of course, Mussolini was able to suppress his political opponents, just like how you saw with Hitler and Stalin as well. Now, there's, of course, a lot of different elements of how Mussolini's totalitarian rule is similar to Hitler's. You see, of course, how he also rigged elections, like we mentioned, suppressed rival parties, and all these other aspects of heavy propaganda to deeply try to convince the Italian people to follow through with his idea of the country. He also did take control of the economy as well, with a state-controlled economy, trying to completely revamp the idea of how industry, agriculture, and trade work for their country.
Quick checkpoint, guys. How did Mussolini begin to have total control of the country? How did Mussolini begin to have total control of the country?
Good job. Thank you so much for responding to that. I really appreciate it. All right. But overall, just as a summary with Mussolini, as we've seen with a lot of these people, loyalty was the key to his empire. If essentially no one followed the fascist rule, violence was always recommended. It was always glorified violence, and blind loyalty demanded to be a part of this new regime. As you guys can see right here, there was a complete rejection of democracy, as it didn't seem to have enough nationalism into it, the idea of trying to pump that Roman glorification. Not only would this propaganda machine be meant for the adults of society, but they would, of course, even try to indoctrinate the youth. Same thing with Hitler with his time. Both of them invested on trying to educate children to think the way they wanted them to think. So this propaganda and indoctrination went really early on for people in their society, as you guys can see right here with our image. Congratulations, you just got your whole overview of the 3 candidates for totalitarianism that are going to be huge characters for the next units that we learn, with, of course, Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and Benito Mussolini. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on the next activity, all you're going to do is do a quick review on recalling the different ways that these individuals gain control and maintained control in their societies. But after that, congratulations, you just finished your history talk. Please make sure that you guys finish this video and finish the small review assignment after. But that's it when it comes to us. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Mr. Martinez.
Mr. Santiago.
And we are signing off. Thank you guys so much, and we look forward to learning more with you guys later.